Well, it's not every day that you get to sit down with one of South Africa's top tech entrepreneurs and get to find out what is top of mind. So with that very, very big question, David, from an investment theme perspective, what is keeping you awake at night at the moment?
Well, it's lovely to see you, and those are such kind words. And I haven't been an entrepreneur for a very long time, but I've been investing in entrepreneurs for a while now. We're quite deliberately anti-thematic. We tend to feel that once the theme has been declared, you're too late. So we've thankfully been involved in some fantastic AI startups, Shield, which is an autonomous drone company. Much more recently, Suno, we invested in nearly 2 years ago. So Suno is probably the most interesting audio or music AI play, certainly on the East Coast, maybe in the world. And it's been fascinating to watch that. So certainly you cannot ignore AI. That being said, I'm not running around chasing AI. I think there are some massive thematic changes in tech globally. And I think one of those is the de-globalization, if you want. So billions of dollars being given now to subsidize re-centering chip manufacturing in the US. So I think that if you're in the chip space, the amount of non-dilutive funding that the government is providing to companies like Micron and Intel, et cetera, you simply cannot ignore. TSMC opening plants. I think that will be a very, very long-term play. So my difficulty is I'm not really macro. I tend to be much more micro, but some of my macro commentary, and treat it as a non-expert, is, I've seen some of the capital spend that the hyperscalers are putting out there for an AI future. I think there's a very exciting part of it. But if I look at the corporate and enterprise take-up of that, even, listed companies that I'm on the boards of, it seems to be much smaller. So I tend to look at the multiples of those hyperscalers and kind of ask myself, how long can this go on for? But certainly they are, large customers of the companies that we tend to back, and they're very large spenders, so we can't ignore them, and large acquirers as well.
I want to stay with the AI theme for a little longer, and perhaps just the simple question: does it excite you or terrify you in terms of how it is altering our reality?
I have to say it hasn't terrified me yet. There are clearly lots of papers and lots of smart people talking about this future, and I think in every wave that is the case. I think that AI could well disappoint in the short term. It's reminiscent of autonomous driving. There's a lot of hype in the short term. I'm more excited by it. I've certainly been using the tools personally for a long time now, and I feel very augmented by the tools. So even if I'm in a new place and I want the top 3 restaurants, I do trivial things to a lot of diligence where I'll try to train the models, and I'm playing with different models. I think one of the very interesting opportunities coming up is what is called tiny models. So these models live on your device, and your device can be offline. And for applications like scanning or translation, all of those applications that didn't quite get there, we're definitely seeing tremendous progress there. If you look at, Apple's been using your phone overnight to with smaller scale models to do inference, for instance, on your photos for a very long time, and you're seeing some plays over there. So that's an area that I'm seeing more in, and I'm interested in. But I think that long term, AI is going to be an incredibly important wave. I just think it could disappoint LPs and macro investors in the short term.
So, David, you make the point in terms of my introduction when I said that you are one of South Africa's most famous tech entrepreneurs. Your legacy in this country is very strong as the CEO and co-founder of Internet Solutions. And of course, you have been in Boston now for around about 16 years. I may be slightly out, but it would be really interesting to get your view on South Africa as it stands today with 2025 on the horizon, I'm sure that you keenly follow the South African political and economic environment, David.
Well, firstly, I have to just say that Internet Solutions was a partnership through and through, and I owe so much to Ronnie and Alon Aptaker and other amazing folks who went on to have incredible entrepreneurial journeys, people like Lior Atti, Saki Masaikos. So there really was a team, and thank you for that. I'll take that for the whole team. Look, I think South Africa has a lot of work to do and very little time to waste. And I get a lot of this insight, frankly, through portfolio companies that I was involved in many years ago, but a lot of it through the nonprofit sector. And what we've done recently with our foundation, Next Up, which is a education and teen unemployment focus, Asime Nyide running that. We see exceptional people still from government, and I sometimes wish these people were running the country. And we see at grassroots level, at places like Olivenhoutbosch, these very committed principals and teachers, and you just look and you go, wow, South Africans are just amazing. But, I think it's fair to say that up to now, leadership feels like it's failed us for the last 30 years, and we've got to get our act together. The problem is when you look at the scope of educating people and then they come out and there's not enough employment, really South Africa needs to create opportunities. And I would say that we've got to be asking our leadership first and foremost to be creating a entrepreneurial friendly environment. I'm not sure that when we started Internet Solutions, it was entrepreneurship friendly enough. With the checks and balances, you can copy, and you've got to let these young, innovative, well-educated people who are also working in the nonprofit sector, you've got to let them free. There's so much red tape, so much friction. It can be very, very frustrating.
You appeal to our leadership. Does that mean you still regard South Africa as home?
I've been in Boston for a very long time now, and my younger kids were born here and they're at school here. So it's hard not to think of Brookline, where I'm speaking to you from, as home. But South Africa will always be home for me. It really will. The people, the community, the country has so much to offer. And Bronwyn, I cannot tell you, I think I'm understating it to say there are at least 50 families, couples, individuals who I have helped plan trips over many years now to South Africa. And people leave the country raving. And they don't just rave about the game reserve in Cape Town. They rave about their visit to Johannesburg and what a rich, solid African country this feels like. So I think there is so much potential in South Africa still.
What about the potential for technology to solve many of our problems here in South Africa? Have you given any thought to potentially how we could leapfrog some of our structural, some of our societal inequalities with technology, given that this is obviously your focal space?
So technology is a tool, and people use technology, and the people have to be unshackled. And there's a degree of education that is still required, I think. But I think technology has always had leapfrog opportunities. If you think back to some of our telecommunications and banking infrastructure, because we were not shackled by past technologies and we could deploy the latest, South Africa, in terms of fiber and general reticulation for communications, is pretty great. If you look at South Africa's banking sector, it's still pretty great. I think that software does have the opportunity, just in terms of developing. You don't have to learn computer languages anymore. And I think that in a way, you hit on something very interesting, where creativity is perhaps the most important skill or important endowment. So I hope that can be the case for South Africa, but I still think there's a basic level of education that we have to give our young people.
Our last conversation was just as COVID had hit. And David, if I remember correctly, tech in agriculture was something that you were focusing on at that juncture. Has that yielded results? I remember something about farms in the ocean.
Sadly not. You've got a great memory. We did start a company that did large-scale, almost farming and ag in the ocean. That didn't work out, and that company actually changed its course to carbon sequestration in the ocean. And the problem is that the market for carbon credits in the US has changed dramatically. So ironically, we had some of the biggest tech companies. We had Microsoft, Spotify, etc. as clients. We didn't have some of the biggest polluters as clients that we should have. But because that market's changed, unfortunately, that company has not worked out. And Bronwyn, therein lies what I do, is we can be very excited. And generally, we are excited first and foremost around teams and then what they're doing. And I was very excited about that team and the application. The company was called Running Tide, very, very well funded. And unfortunately, quite recently, we've called it a day.
So many entrepreneurs will be watching this interview, and their dream would be to have the founder collective agree to work with them as a partnership, grow their businesses. What is your advice? And you must get asked this all the time. So I'm so sorry if you've heard it ad nauseum, but I have to capitalize on the opportunity and ask you for your advice to entrepreneurs.
It's a long journey. Really think through, is this for you? I think have something that you're good at, that you have an edge. I sometimes hear this advice of something that you're passionate about, and I'm not sure it's fair advice always. I think having an end point that galvanizes you and pulls you along when it's tough helps a lot. But try to think about something that you're good at, or have a team around you that you resonate with. So I gravitate towards partnerships and always feel that the partners around me, particularly right now, my partners at Founder Collective, have skills and have qualities that I lack, and we complement each other. So I would say having people around you who energize you makes such a difference. Sometimes the who is more important than the what, even in terms of what you're doing, and what uniquely brought you to this idea. I think, I was looking at a VC yesterday who read Moneyball and just launched, decided to go into baseball as a career and then came back to VC. And I think if there's something that just galvanizes you, don't ignore it. I think we all have these thumbnails of a chance that we tend to ignore on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes if you actually just latch into that, it can pull you along. And then I think thinking through your resources, we have preached capital efficiency from day one. My partners and I at Founder Collective all grew companies with very little capital, and we tend to think of capital as a bit of a curse. So the companies that get so much capital early on, it's a bit like we think of Scott Belsky coined this term. He's the chief product officer at Adobe, saying that capital is like carbohydrates and resourcefulness is protein. So think of how resourceful you can be. And that being said, try to understand what capital you may need to launch an endeavor.
I did spend a little time just refreshing my memory. And when I Google you, not only do you come up as one of South Africa's most famous and successful tech entrepreneurs, but Uber is the brand that is repeatedly associated with David Frankel. Perhaps if you look back on what you've achieved to this point, obviously with your founders and your co-founders, does Uber resonate as one of the biggest success stories from a brand perspective?
Well, firstly, we owe Uber entirely to my partner, Eric Paley, who saw the opportunity and was lucky or smart enough to be in with the first check. And Eric is so humble. I recall one of our investors at an annual dinner saying to Eric, leaning over the table, I can see this, just saying, Eric, how did you know? How did you know? And instead of retrofitting that answer, or retrofitting the strategy, Eric looked him in the eye and said, I didn't know. The company that I funded before and the company I funded after, I had just as much hope for. And, some of the Founder Collective was never designed for these outrageous wins. Uber has certainly been an incredible win for us. Eric has had one win that is for us and for our investors has certainly been even more monumental than Uber. That was the Trade Desk, which today is probably the biggest company in ad tech in the world. And it's public. We owned about 12.5% of that company on IPO. That company has gone on to 30x its IPO price. I would say so much of what we do, by the way, is timing. So we didn't stay in until that 30x. We distributed shares to our investors, and some may have stuck around. I'm lucky to still own some Trade Desk shares, but I don't own my entire position from that distribution. But there's a lot of timing here, and I would say that 2010, when Eric invested in Uber, was an incredible time. It was a capital-scarce environment. It was just post the real nub of the financial crisis, but that was carrying on. And I would say over my career, I can look at vintage years. 2003, 2004 were amazing years. It's actually when I first got involved in my two partners, Eric and Micah's company. But Uber was certainly, in terms of branding and being able to be associated with that, pretty extraordinary for us.
On this people theme, something that has crept into regular engagements from my side certainly is that often people disappoint you. How often does that happen from your perspective? You get excited, you fall in love with the team, so to speak, but actually they end up disappointing.
We end up not getting the success that we could have hoped for plenty. I would say people disappoint me. That phrase, that seems to have been very few times when I reflect on that. I think that if people try something out and they put their heart and soul into it, and they hire reasonably good people or very good people, and it just doesn't work out, but you look back and you go, they tried absolutely everything. They were smart. They were thoughtful. I would say sometimes the disappointment comes from having raised way too much capital and then being under pressure to use that capital and making easier decisions that didn't keep you strong and fit for the next chapter. You look back on that and you go, that's disappointing. But capital really can be a drug. But I look at some of our losses and I look back even at a company like Running Tide, and I think Marty did absolutely everything he could. He may not have cut his burn fast enough, but he also had a situation where customers were asking for more and more and more, and that required him to go and hire more experts and pay them more. And, the customers were always moving the cheese. I think of a guy, Bertrand Bodson. We started a company called Bragster. This was even before Founder Collective. He was a classmate of mine. I gave him about $2 million. Intel Capital gave him $10 million. We lost everything. Bertrand went on to become the chief digital officer of Novartis, and one of Novartis's top 6 people. He then went on to have a huge career as CEO of a large supermarket chain in the UK. I look back and I go, Bertrand never disappointed me. He did everything he could. The context was tough. 5 years later, he would have been great. I did a biotech startup, pre-Founder Collective, in the neurodegenerative disease space, funding a guy, Peter Lansbury, who had a very important lab at Harvard. Everybody lost their money. We sold it to AstraZeneca on a milestone workout. Everybody lost their money. But you look at those teams and you go, entrepreneurship is really hard. And actually, goes back to the AI thing I was saying is, why I think AI will disappoint is it's a bit like Hollywood. There will be that one blockbuster. There may be, 1 in 100 blockbusters. And a lot of people will lose their money and lose their human capital and their time in between. And that's the entrepreneurship territory.
One final question. The US political environment. I wouldn't be worth my salt if I didn't get a view from you, given your position in the US and what is unfolding. Any insights from your perspective as to what you see happening on the ground?
Look, I wish I was personally really galvanized in one direction or another. I have to say I'm not. And I think there is a there's a tough backdrop in terms of polarization in the US and in the world. I certainly don't think social media has helped that at all. So I think there's the real world, and then there's the Twitter sphere, which always feels hysterical. And sometimes I have to remind myself just to really pull out of it. This is one of those times. It doesn't in any way affect my day job. I don't think of politics really. I think of the big middle of this country, and I think of still underserved consumers. And I think there's this very easy way of looking at the US as big cities and the coasts, and I think that's a huge, huge mistake. And I think the US has tremendous work to do as well in terms of better services for its people. And, you're at one of these moments where the Gini coefficient or the wealth disparity in the US is, and has been since I've been back here, at an all-time high. And I think that needs to be addressed. So I hope that whoever wins and the next administration really thinks carefully about that. I worry about deglobalization and decoupling from the world as well. I really hope that does not happen.
David, I feel super privileged to be able to sit down with you every now and again and delve into your insights. And I'm sure that the Business News community is going to feel as equally privileged. David Frankel is the managing partner and co-founder of the Founder Collective.
Bronwyn, thank you so much for being so kind and for giving me this opportunity. Have a wonderful day.